Okay, everyone, I think we can just go ahead and get started. Welcome, I'm Melissa Ayton. I'm the Senior Research and Conferences Officer for the International Forum for Democratic Studies here at the National Endowment for Democracy. On behalf of NED's Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellows program, I am pleased to welcome everyone to today's presentation on the role of open data in strengthening Nigerian democracy, featuring Reagan-Fascell Fellow Joshua Olufemi. We are delighted to have with us as discussant Christopher O'Connor, Senior Program Officer for Africa here at NED. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the Reagan-Fascell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated journalists, activists, and scholars to conduct independent research and pursue projects here at NED. Now in our 18th year, the program has hosted more than 290 fellows from over 90 countries, which is pretty incredible if you think about it. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for unwavering commitment to democracy in Nigeria. Recent data from the World Poverty Clock projects that Nigeria may have already overtaken India as the country with the highest levels of extreme poverty. Yet we also know that Nigeria is resource-rich, enjoying vast deposits of oil and other natural resources. As Joshua will soon explain, without open data that is complete and accurate, it is difficult to unpack these contradictory facts. Does Nigeria suffer from high levels of poverty because its natural resources are stolen by corrupt officials and business people? Or do government officials not lack the data they need to implement sound policies that benefit ordinary citizens? Or is it both? Probably both. But without good data, it's impossible for civil society, journalists, and even government officials to really unpack these types of puzzles. Joshua Olufemi, Head of Knowledge and Innovation at Premium Times Center for Investigative Reporting, will highlight both the progress and persistent challenges in leveraging data for good governance and political accountability in Nigeria. Joshua is a media innovation and development executive with 10 years of experience in investigative journalism, open data advocacy, civic innovation, and media development in Nigeria. Currently the head of knowledge and innovation at Premium Times and program director at the Premium Times Center for Investigative Journalism in Abuja, he has trained over 300 journalists across Nigeria on data-driven journalism and has managed more than 8 accountability and governance projects on a range of issues. He also contributes to an online open contracting platform called Budeshi, which makes data on government budgets and public services accessible to the public. He has helped to establish data journalism desks for 2 leading investigative journalism organizations, Premium Times and the International Center for Investigative Reporting. Chris O'Connor is Senior Program Officer for West Africa at NED, where he oversees a diverse civil society grants program in Nigeria that aims to strengthen democracy, improve human rights, and consolidate peace. He also works on West Africa regional, Liberia, and Ghana governance projects. Prior to joining NED, Christopher served as an International Development Fellow with Catholic Relief Services, where he worked on peace building and good governance projects. He received his MA in Conflict Resolution from Georgetown and a BA in African, Asian, and Russian History from Washington and Lee University. We will now turn the floor over to Joshua, who will speak for approximately 25 minutes, followed by Chris for about 10. For those of you on Twitter, you can follow this presentation and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NetEvents, or by following the forum at Think Democracy or the Endowment at NE Democracy. If you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones, and let me take an opportunity to thank everyone involved in this event, most especially Emily Myers, who has offered vital assistance. So, Joshua?
All right. Thank you very much, Melissa. Good afternoon, everyone. So glad that you're here, and hopefully I'm able to, make your afternoon, with this presentation today. So today I'll be talking about the role of open data in strengthening Nigerian democracy, Interestingly, tomorrow, which is June 12th, some part of Nigeria will be celebrating what we call the Democracy Day. For two reasons. It's the day that Nigeria's election was, stolen by a military dictatorship, and secondly, because it's 20 years also down the line, since 1999 that we returned to democracy in the country. And this has affected a lot of things, since the return to democracy, economically, politically, and also security especially, and of course, the livelihood of everyday Nigerian. And in doing that, I'll be, going through the structure of what is the role that open data has played, in this 20 years of democracy, or return to democracy. What are still, the eminent challenges that we're still facing in leveraging data, open government data for democratic growth and all that is relevant to it, and what intervention I've been trying to offer and what way to go with that. But as a form of background, I just want us to give us an overview of what is the concept of open government data, or when we talk about open data, data means a lot of things. But as a concept of government providing information and the use of it. And four major cardinals of open data is first that it has to be proactive, and being proactive meaning that it has to be provided even before it is requested by citizens. So at every point in time that government collects data or interfaces with public data or produces its own, it's making it available ahead of the need or request for it by citizens. Second point is that it has to be complete, and by complete meaning that you don't remove anything that is not of security or that doesn't have any security implications for citizens or what we in Nigeria generally term as national security. The third thing is that it has to be shareable. That means that it is easy to distribute or pass across from one hand to the other and easily. And the most important one, which, and it will explain why we have it in blue, or darker blue, is it has to be usable by citizens and by every other segment of the population. And you can see what a representation of that can look like, from stack of papers, folders in government offices, and the use that you can put it to either making some analytical, providing analytical insight into it, or just providing representation for public use. But why is this important anyways? Why should government make data available to citizens, or why should it even open up its data? And another four key importance or outcomes of providing data to the public is first that it helps transparency and accountability, and I'll be talking more about that later on. When you know what your government is either doing with your revenue or the tax that it collects, or what are the things, what drives its policies, you are able to either demand more or you are taken out of darkness from how government makes its policy. More importantly is what it can do for economic growth and innovation. And you can see from developed democracies how the availability of spatial data, location data has made businesses thrive. You can name them all over the place, and how it has also helped how the corporate society work hand in hand with government to make entrepreneurial endeavors possible. Third importance is that it helps government also to efficiently review its policies and its interventions, and how all of these things drive democracy at the end of the day. But paramountly is what it's able to do for inclusion. It helps every other segment of government or of the society to also participate in the democratic governance of the country. And as a form of inclusion, what it does is it helps citizens to also better understand what government policies are, and also attempt by citizens to also hold them to account or demand, for explanations for why things are done. And a good example of how that has been done in Nigeria, since we're talking about the potentials of open data to the democracy of Nigeria, is a social accountability project called Udeme in Nigeria, run by the Premium Time Center for Investigative Journalism. What this does is to take the budget data, the capital project data of Nigeria, and provide it as information to citizens across constituencies and ask them a good question. Do you know that a total of X amount of money, for in this instance 1.2 billion naira, has been allocated for certain project in your community? And citizens having that awareness are able to ask questions from their representatives about the status of the project, who is running the project, and begins to drive some feedback mechanism and civic engagement of citizens in governance. More importantly is the power that data, when you put it in the hands of journalists or the media, the power that it can drive in reporting. An example in Nigeria is still how much of procurement, budget, and data that has been provided to journalists, and this has helped journalists to drive accountability and to even critically analyze what government is using citizens' money for. A second importance of open data in Nigeria, or how it has helped in Nigeria, is it's been helping to combat misinformation and a lot of disinformation that come across religious, tribal, and every other kind of political manipulations that you can have. And beyond that, journalists sometimes we also fall victim of the bias and stereotypes that we have in the community because we are also part of society. And data that is being made available to us has helped to be more objective and stay off biases. And a very good example is the challenge about who spends Nigeria's excess crude fund. Excess crude fund is the money that you get when what you budgeted for, what's your budget for revenue from oil, and is lower than what you realize. So the difference is kept for the raining day. And so there's always been agitation that this administration from 1999 to 2003 or the other one is the victim. But data presented to journalists help to tell that every administration at every point in time always go to the SS crude account, and nobody is a saint across the administrations that we've had in the last 20 years. So open data is helping journalists to be more critical and to provide more insight into how governance is done in the country. And it's also both on the side of civil society and citizens and journalists helping to expose and address the issues of corruption. And I'll run you through a simple story here and how open data helped to achieve this in the country. So naturally, what you get every year is that the National Assembly budget, till today, is not open to the public. And so every year, about 150 billion naira, you can say roughly about $300 to $400 million is always allocated to the National Assembly, which is our parliamentarians in the country, and nobody knows for what and for who. But through the use of freedom of information by the Premium Time Center for Investigative Journalism, we requested from the Cash Management Office how much has been disbursed by the Minister of Finance to the National Assembly. And when that was provided to the center, that was handed over to journalists to report. And they realized that a lot of the money that has been going from the Minister of Finance to the legislature have been out of unappropriated money. And the question is, why would the executive arm be colluding with the National Assembly or the parliament or the legislative arm to rob or to misappropriate funds? And that continued, and after a series of investigations, it was realized that the National Assembly has been coercing the minister because of some forgery scandal, that they were privy to, and which they didn't make public to the, they didn't make public for citizens to know. And when this was made public, the minister had to resign. And so you see how the availability of data and how much the use of data can help not only to address the issue of corruption, but also to curb excesses of various sectors of the economy. But with this much being done by the center that I work for and other institutions in the country, civil society organizations in the country who also do things in the extractive, in the health sector, you see that a lot of challenges still remain, which, of course, with access to data. If I ask a lot of people here, or a lot of Nigerians back home, where to get the population data today, it's almost nowhere. And, and this is caused by a lot of factors. The most important one, or I would say the major problem is lack of capacity on the part of government, even to collect its data. Another is the political will. So we have a 10-year cycle for census in the country. The last census was conducted in 2006. So you expect that in 2016, another census will be done. This is 2019. We're still waiting for the census. Now, the population demographics in Nigeria is used to determine a lot of policy and revenue distribution decisions in the country. As a matter of fact, revenue distribution, which is tagged the federal allocation account, which is from the federal allocation account in the country, is basically about 30 to 40% based on the population of each state. Now, if you've not conducted a population census since 2006, that means in the last 13 years, what we've been using to determine what goes to each state is just estimates. And if you consider the migration, rural, urban, migration, if you consider every other reason. As a matter of fact, rainfall is used in Nigeria to determine how much each state gets. But do we have, updated data of rainfall in the country? There are other, important data that should drive the current decisions and policies of government, but we only have to rely on estimates that is provided. And you can see here what the Nigerian census says, and the CIA World Fact Book is just telling us that it's an estimated population. Today, we don't know whether we are 180 million, 197 million. We're just using 2.3, 2.6, 3% to determine our population growth. But what's more important for Nigeria from this is, when you give birth to a child today, you're supposed to plan for the education of the child in the next 6 years, 11 years, primary education, secondary education. But we don't have data about the number of kids that are born in Nigeria today. So how do you do educational policy decision? How do you plan health? How do you even determine what other infrastructure or facilities that the country require? And those are the major challenges that the political will and the capacity of government to even collect data is creating in the country. And you can see here, based on Open Data Barometer of 2016, the two important question is, do we have the data? Does the data exist? And you can see across that it is all green, meaning that the data does exist in some form, somewhere, collected or not. And is the data available online from government in any form? You can see how the red dots, which shows 0 or less to nothing, is showing. So in Nigeria, you can't find the land registration data. And if you check the news, you see how many of the Nigerian land buyers have become victims of the fact that they can't access information about land. Transportation is a big problem, and that's why innovation that we should have had in the transportation sector is being delayed, and we are still relying on foreign innovations that are driven by data provided globally to drive the Uber. So and with the availability of local data, we're able to, the economic community is able to do much more. You're able to provide more services and all of that. So you still have challenges But the thing is, the question I always ask, and colleagues also ask is, do government collect this data? Yes, they do, but they are always in paper forms. They are kept in the office. And when they care, or when the corruption scandal is coming up, you can either have a snake swallowing all the papers, or you can have it burnt off, depending on what the situation is in the country. And when even the National Bureau of Statistics, which is the official data publisher in the country, is providing the data that is able to collect. They come in formats that are not accessible, and by accessible meaning you can't easily work with them. You can't easily, and they also rely on estimates. National Bureau of Statistics will only publish revenue distribution figure 2 months after the money has been distributed. And so it means you can't even do you can't do real-time accountability or monitoring of how revenue is being spent, because the receipts don't come from anybody. You only need to wait for, and when they even come, they come in PDF format. When the Nigerian budget, the 2019 budget, when the appropriation will be made public, what you're going to have is thousands of pages in PDF. And as a journalist, I want to run with that. It takes me a lot of capacity to first convert it and to clean it. And these are major challenges. So even when they're available, they are inaccessible, or you can't work with them. And on the part of citizens, it becomes unusable. The business community always want to use data to determine which way to go. Investment in Nigeria, I was discussing with a colleague today, you don't even know if our stock exchange is improving or not. And people still keep buying stocks. We don't even know how much of foreign investment in the stock exchange is driving. We don't know I don't know any reliable consumption data in Nigeria beyond the fact that we have 197 million Nigerians, so you can always go invest in Nigeria. And foreigners, foreign investors, even local investors just use that estimated number to determine or to jump into the market. And sometimes you see them run out and go to neighboring countries that are working or providing data to the public. It's also difficult for colleagues in journalism and civil society actors to translate this data into ways that citizens can engage. First, because there is a lack of it. Second, because even when it is available, we can't make use of it. So the burden bearer at the end of the day is citizen, the citizen that is unable to use it as a political tool to demand accountability. So you see the potential. It's able to provide is an accountability tool. Is able to drive entrepreneurial innovations and economic growth in the country. But where are we? But you have all these challenges of access and unusable data in the country. And in my own work, I'll provide a little bit of personal background to why DataFight was born, or why I decided, or why I took it upon myself to create an intervention to bridge the gap between access and also providing insight and intelligence to the available data when we are able to liberate it. And the personal story is, Melissa was talking about the number of journalists I've trained. As of today, if you look at the count, both myself and my colleagues at the Premium Times, we've trained over 1,000 journalists. And when you train them in data journalism, they're so excited. They want to go back and try it. And then they can't find the data. And when they even get the data, you see colleagues will call you 2 weeks later and say, please, let me send you a PDF document I got from internal affairs or from one ministry. Can you help me even turn it into Excel sheet? Can you help me turn it into a spreadsheet that I can use and I can analyze? So you see a lot of challenges with, when journalists are trained, how to now make sense of the data. Another challenge is, investors come around sometimes, they say, oh, you're a journalist, Joshua or Dakpo or any other journalist, and say, can you give us an accurate data about the number of debts that is that you have in Abuja, for instance, and we are looking everywhere for it and we can't find it. And so you can't advise investment, you can't advise development sector, you can't advise anybody, you can't scrutinize government. And so the idea is to combine first the goal of providing, generating new data sets, collecting information that is not available or government has not provided in it at all, and collecting it and making it available for, various communities of users. The other is to even turn the available data on different websites of government and civil society and make them also available to citizens. The third reason for providing, machine-readable data sets, and what we mean by that is one that you can easily plug into your, map tools or into your visualization tool and make sense of, is that civil society organizations working in the open data advocacy landscape in Nigeria keep some form of data, but they are in silos. I can name like 10 different civil society in Nigeria that provide some form of open data. But where's the go-to place for researchers, for journalists to find all of this data? So DataFight is helping to collect all of this data, put them together in a place, and offer it to every user that is interested. But to continue the culture of telling compelling stories with data is also now the data journalism component of DataFight, which is taking that data when it is either collected, curated, or and making it into analytical insights for citizens, for policymakers as a whole. But the third important thing, which continues to drive why data is important to me as a journalist, as a media innovation expert, is the question that my boss asked me 5 years ago, or the challenge that he threw at me 5 years ago and said, in Nigeria and globally, journalism is facing a critical sustainability challenge. And your role is to make sure that we find a way out of this challenge. And so data, either as a service or data as a democratic tool for us, is also a way of experimenting, sustainability or revenue for journalism in Nigeria and across Africa as a whole. And these are part of the stories that have already been written. As of today, you have about 76 data sets cutting across aviation, budget, procurement, health data on the platform. Hopefully, as we build a community of practice around it, down the line, it's able to become not only a data provider, but it's also offering it as a service to the larger community. As next steps, three pivotal activities is to build a community of practice around DataFight, to drive data collection and reporting in the country. And this will include journalists, civil society, and other advocates of open data in the country. And we'll also work with government to also help leverage the data that they have and see how we can move those pile of paper in those offices and make them, digitize them and make them available. My boss, who is in the room today, I don't call him boss anyway, I call him an uncle, went into the University of Ibadan, archive, and he came back and he told me, Joshua, you need to visit that place. If you see all the newspapers that Nigeria has ever produced in the last almost 150 years, you can't even rescue it. And that's 150 years of media history that we can't capture. And I've had opportunity with my colleagues here to visit museums. I've been to the Library of Congress, and I'm like, this is a big challenge. And this is the kind of thing that you have. There are court records in Nigeria that we need to rescue because they provide not only historical information or data to the public, they also help to connect the social network of politicians and every other kind of actor in the politics. We have other challenges in the country. So the goal is to work with government institutions and other open data organizations to liberate that data and make it available, and to continue in that journalistic flair to provide insight and intelligence into the whole data that is collected or curated. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. You gave us a lot to think about. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. But before we open up the floor, let's turn to Christopher O'Connor for his comments. Chris.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Joshua, for really a very insightful presentation. I think in selecting open government data, you've really identified a very big issue, if not the biggest, in the field of good governance in Nigeria, and one that truly permeates all aspects of that space in terms of accountability and transparency, political inclusion, economic reform, even government efficiency. For almost every governance challenge that you can think of, you've identified really a data deficiency that's a big contributing factor, and improved public access and understanding of data as a partial solution. In your presentation, you illustrated the many problems posed by the lack of data, whether it be the outdated census, limited agricultural production figures, incomplete budgets, all of which pose significant development and governance challenges. Perhaps adroitly, you chose to avoid some of the more problematic data deficiencies in Nigeria, whether it's really truly delving into oil production figures, not even what the price of oil benchmark price is, but what's being produced, how it's being exported, or even security spending figures. And these are really respectively one of the largest revenue streams for the government and one of the perhaps least transparent expenditures of the Nigerian government. Without question, there really is a dearth of publicly available government data in Nigeria, but I think it's important to reiterate one of the points that you made here, and that's not all of these data deficiencies are the same. In some cases, the data exists, but it's not easily accessible. That might mean it's in stacks and archives somewhere. In other cases, there simply is not the investment or capacity to produce and share that data accurately. And in other cases, on a more malicious front perhaps, the government intentionally chooses not to produce or not to share that data. Civil society approaches to these data gaps will vary significantly, but I think there's an acknowledgement that some of these approaches are going to be more collaborative, and with DataFight, there may be collaboration in terms of helping the government produce and share that data, and some may be more combative, such as the investigative journalism outfits that are trying to address issues of corruption. Unfortunately, within civic space, I think there's even a lack of understanding of what data is out there, let alone what's accessible, and I think that's something that you're really hoping to address, again, with DataFight. I myself have gone on to numerous government websites trying to find voter information, budget information, even statistics figures about the National Assembly, and I will concede if you dig deep enough at times, you will find some information, but rarely is it fully complete, rarely is it easy to digest, and this really presents significant barriers in terms of gathering the data that's necessary for informed policy analysis and discourse. I would really like to focus, though, on your proposed solution, at least your initiative to make government data open, and that is DataFight. At least as you describe it, this sounds like a very needed and laudable effort to address significant gaps with knowledge in terms of government, civil society, and really the broader public. And I think the crowdsourcing and development of a community of practice dimension of that approach is really something that's needed for such a heavy lift. And as you suggest, there are innumerable opportunities that come out of this data for better in government, for advancing democracy in Nigeria. As DataFight evolves, I would pose a number of questions to you and your colleagues as you try to figure out what is the most constructive approach to addressing and making that data appropriate. And these really relate to your mission, to your mandate, and to your overall capacity. These are not meant to be criticisms, but really reflections on the challenges that you're likely to grapple with as you move forward with this initiative. And I would, again, really commend you, because this seems like an initiative that is a public service, not just one for civil society, but one designed for the Nigerian public. First and foremost, I would ask, do you envision DataFight primarily serving as an aggregator and distributor of government data, meaning is your mission to deliver open government data, or are, at the end of the day, you driven to play a direct role in interpreting data and in advancing government accountability, efficiency, popular participation in government, economic reform, and the like? Do you want to be a passive, or do you want to be an active platform? If the latter, how are you determining and prioritizing what data you want to go after? And are you interpreting that data for the audiences that you seek? In prioritizing and interpreting, you are inherently making value judgments and perhaps taking political stances, if not necessarily partisan ones. And how does this affect the audience for your data and the perceptions of the credibility of that data? Even if you're not politicizing it, you will have others that take that data and politicize it for their own purposes. For example, if you published accurate data on education spending in, say, Borno, Lagos, and River State, and you highlighted discrepancies in per-student expenditures, would the public start asking about regional bias, revenue sharing, security policies, service delivery efficacy? Do you try to guide this narrative? And if you leave the contextualization to others, how much control as an institution would you have over the process and ultimately where these narratives lead? And this leads to a third question, which is ultimately, who are your target consumers? I know that you said that there's really a lack of credible data for pretty much everybody in Nigeria, from the government to the public and civil society and journalists in between. But in identifying those, you're going to clearly run into some challenges. One, will you have the time and capacity to support data and the interpretation, analysis of this data for all these audiences? And then in gathering and providing data for one of the groups of stakeholders, especially if you're interpreting it, are you limiting your ability to work with some of the other stakeholders? For example, if you're working with journalists that are working on anti-corruption campaigns and using government data for that, how likely is the government to share data with you and really to seek out your advice, your consultation in terms of how they themselves are managing that data? And beyond this, if you limit your focus or your audience or prioritize them, where do you feel that ultimately you will have the most impact? At what level, say at what level of government, federal, state, local, on what issues? Are you looking at the oil sector? Are you looking at the public health sector? Are you looking at the economic sector? These all would be massive investments of time and resources. And then really, with whom are you trying to influence these conversations? All of these questions aside, which I think that you will successfully grapple with as DataFight evolves, how are you going to deal with our ability, sort of human ability, to manipulate data for our own individual purposes, to politicize that, to advance our own agenda, even if that's not necessarily what that data says, on the one hand, but perhaps more worryingly, how will you deal with politicians, leaders, even the public's ability or willingness to simply ignore data? I suspect a partial response to this would be that the public needs better exposure to data, better understanding of this data, but is this enough to counter the fake news, the misinformation, disinformation that you alluded to in your presentation that we saw with the recent elections? In this work, you are not going to be able to identify all the challenges or all the opportunities that will emerge from enhancing open government data, or to even plan for them. But I would encourage you through this community of practice, through broader consultations with civil society, with government, and with the public, to identify the data needs that others want and use that to help guide your work, but also to really seek out what their governance challenges are, what they're highlighting as democratic deficits in that space, and to work backwards to identify data to solve those needs as well. I will leave it there, but thank you, Joshua, once again, for providing us with an advanced introduction to open government data in Nigeria, and we wish you the best of luck with DataFight.
Thank you, Chris. Those were some tough questions. Do you want to take just a couple minutes to address kind of maybe some main points, or would you rather kind of open it up for discussion with the audience first?
Let me attempt some. Maybe that will also inform how the public, how the frame the questions. But I'll start by saying, if you were the one to help, ask Nigerian politicians the questions before we elect them, probably you help a lot in it. You help the electorate a lot in deciding, because your questions are so critical and reflective of. Sorry. Okay, so I was saying, the questions you asked, if we allow you to facilitate, like debate before the elections, it will help the electors to also decide well, because they're very reflective questions, and thank you for them, Chris. A lot of questions, I'll try to answer some of them. The first one about which, side is DataFight standing? Is it to be a collector, or is it to drive, insight? I think at the moment it's trying to play the two roles together, and that's because of how the convergence. You need data, but as well you need the insight. You need to provide some context to it. So, but the whole idea is for the collection. The collection is for what I would say is data as a service. That's the one I alluded to, is looking at how to generate more revenue for journalism. For us, we see that data can become a service you can offer to not just citizens and government, but also to the corporate sector or the private sector, both in Nigeria and outside of Nigeria, in helping them to decide what investment or what other functions that they can perform. But on the side of providing context or interpretation of this data, that is more of the civic or the social responsibility of DataFight. And why is that important? If you track in the last 10 years, we've been having a lot of both religious, tribal, and some other form of conflict. And sometimes it's driven by the kind of information and interpretation and biases that people provide to them. In Nigeria, you kind of have some kind of information that the North gets a lot more from revenue that is distributed. But how do we determine how that, if that is true? And if we're just providing the data to the public and say, okay, this month, which is what the NBS does, it just tells us this is how much everybody, earned this month. By just looking at the figure, it seems as if, truly the North is earning a lot. But if you do that, if you take that data and you divide it by the population, 2006 population, you will even see that per capita, income to each citizen of the state does not show any form of inequality or lack of fairness in the way that the money is distributed. So sometimes you need to provide context, and it's also, like I said, is to continue to promote that culture of using data to tell compelling stories, because that's another challenge on the side of it. So for now, the role will emerge, but for the collection, which is the other question you had, is to create a community of interest. We've experimented at Premium Time Center, how much you can use, undergraduates to drive accountability. And we believe that it can also turn every institution in the country into some kind of accountability, infrastructure or mechanism at local or grassroots level. So that's one way to look at it. In terms of stakeholder consultation, that's a yes. It's already started. In March, what we did was to first throw out a survey to ask the question, would you even want data journalism in the country? And what's more important for you in terms of the kind of information that you want? And based on the feedback that's been provided, you see that people want to know, if they want information on health, education, livelihood, and these things will drive the conversation that takes priority, the data that takes priority, the extractive sector, the agri sector, the health sector, and that's why it's been prioritized, even for the kind of work that DataFight is started to do in the country. I think I'll leave it there for now. And
Sure, some of the themes and the questions Chris asked will come up from questions from the audience. So, floor is open. Who wants to be the first to ask a question? Let me ask that you introduce yourself when you, before you ask your question.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. My name is Julien Kyle Lewis from the illustrious Howard University here in Washington, D.C. What we know, I have a question for Joshua. What we know at my school about Africa is that most of the most intelligent people in Africa come from Nigeria. But what we have learned over our historical studies is that many of the problems in Africa come from a situation where the absolute smartest Nigerians make really, really, really bad decisions with the intelligence that they have. And it makes it a really horrible situation for people who are not that smart, other Africans, and that causes so much turmoil and unrest and selfishness that drives down the entire continent just because of people coming from Nigeria who are so smart. So do you have any kind of opinion on that kind of understanding that we have at Howard University about how to, within our own communities, control the folks who are the smartest but want to do some of the most terrible things? Thanks.
Would you like to answer that?
right away.
Yes?
Okay.
That's how it works.
You see, so I'll start by also, framing my response from the issue that I raised about how we, contextualize things without using data. The only reason why it will look as if Nigeria is the smartest, and I had a conversation this morning about it, is because if you look at the proportion of Nigerians in the continent, it already tells you that most of the things that you will see, will be Nigerians. I think that there's a figure, I don't want to give you a wrong one, that says 1 out of every 5, Africans are Nigerians. So that means if you're looking for 1 out of 5 smart people in Africa, it will be a Nigerian. So first, that issue of Nigerian being smarter than every other person on the continent, I think it's relative, and so I will not agree with that, or the only way I will agree with that is to say, yeah, because we have a big population, something around 180 to 190, 200 million, and the entire continent, I think it's about less than 1 billion, I think it's just about 600 million, I can't figure that out. So that's one. How, the decisions or the actions of Nigerians influence every other, it's just the same thing. If you are the one that feel, half the cup, it means that every other contamination comes from that point of view. But why are the intelligent ones the problems for the unintelligent ones? If you said my opinion, so it's my opinion now. I think the challenge is also the fact that we don't have a lot of models. And historically, our leaders have been a greater challenge for Nigerians. So if I'm looking for a politician in Nigeria to aspire to in the last 20 years, probably I can't find any. So if I take over, if I become the president or any other policy maker, it's difficult for me to draw inspiration from anywhere beyond maybe what I've read in books or the ones that I've seen, or what I also feel like doing from personally. But on the whole, the availability of information also can help. I was telling someone today that if a Nigerian, a well-meaning politician in Nigeria wants to drive things, he needs information, he needs data, right? So you start, for instance, and forgive me for mentioning this, you start a 600 billion social investment or social emancipation project based on what data? And when you're going to review your the impact, you're just basing it on anecdotal testimonials from beneficiaries. That's what the Office of the President is doing in the country, investing money into different things. So it's a laudable thing, but it's not driven by data, and even the assessment is not driven by data. So on the whole, we're back to that point of chaos, point of anarchy. So I think lack of actionable data, lack of leadership, and of course our size is why Nigeria continues to be the big brother and big headache of the continent.
I also wanted to ask you to go back to something Chris touched on, is what incentivizes government to share data that could then be used against them in terms of exposing corruption and possibly making them lose their positions and that kind of thing? Like, why would, everyone knows Nigeria struggles with corruption, so why would government officials be willing to either share or package data in a way that would allow them to then face scrutiny from civil society and journalists?
So I imagine that the question is, why would they not want to provide data?
Why would they want to?
Why would they want to?
Yeah.
I think first it's also useful for them, to drive, their own, policy decisions, especially if they are well-meaning and if they, if they are, progressive in their thinking. If you hide data about school enrollment in 30 states out of the 36 states of Nigeria, it makes it difficult for either your federal minister or your state ministers, to even, make decisions on how to, improve or change the paradigm in that regard. So that is one. The other is that the more information that you hide, the more, the challenges that you face with even combating corruption, right? Part of the things that we saw with, our investigations, the Panama Papers investigation, was that as much as the anti-corruption agencies wanted to prosecute the officials, they didn't even have the data to do that. So, so you have challenges where even well-meaning agencies and institutions of government, because other institutions and agencies don't provide the data that they need to drive their work, it makes it very difficult. It was difficult for, like I mentioned in one of my examples, the minister, was given a list of companies that the National Assembly had to pay, and about 41 of the companies were not even registered on government, database, because it was difficult for anyone to verify. So it's more or less like it's counterproductive for government not to provide data, because when you don't provide on one side, it creates a lot of ripple effect for every of your well-meaning initiative or interventions in the country. How do you even do urban and regional planning when you don't have land data? How do you innovate around your transportation when you don't even know the number of potholes that you have in the country? So what's driving your maintenance structure? The housing policy, what's driving the policy? Do you have, in the first 2 years of Buhari's administration from 2015, they were still combating the challenge of ghost workers. So if you still have ghost workers within the public sector, it means that you have leakages that is not, it's unwarranted. So I feel like it drives efficiency, like I mentioned. If government has it as a goal, to drive accountability, to be more efficient, to block leakages, and to look for, and it's ready to be criticized, for good purpose. I think it will open up its data. And because you also then have a civil society that is ready and able to support that process. In Nigeria right now, about 3 to 4, media and civil society organizations are supporting an anti-corruption agency called ICPC to also monitor, implementation of procurement, public procurement in the country. That's how much the civil society is ready to help when government. But that data that the ICPC is using to do that is based on the fact that freedom of information requests have been done, by these civil society organizations. So another reason why I've been trained by my own boss, is that when the Constitution, says you should provide something, it becomes a false incentive. So the lack of political will by government not to even provide data, it's, as far as I'm concerned, breaking the law.
Great. Okay, it looks like we have several questions. Maybe I'll take several at once. Yes, you, and then Joe, and then the woman in the back. Just please remember to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Paul Lubeck from Hopkins SICE, and we had talked earlier last week about your vision for social entrepreneurship, right? Which I enthusiastically support. I mean, you're coming from the Premium Times, the leading investigative journalist institution that's made an enormous difference. And the questions I have link up with Chris, and I think you're going to need to develop a strategy, not less abstract on corruption and whatever. We all know what the political class in Nigeria looks like. Right? Everyone's dealt with them here. Understand they're completely opposed to open data or any information about their activities in general. I think that's a safe generalization. There are all sorts of cover-ups on oil. There's cover-ups on voting security. That's completely off the books. What I want you to do is to think about, talk about how would you leverage the reputation of Premium Times to be able to get funding to create a unit that'll support the project you're thinking about. And then I would recommend thinking about a campaign, a couple issues. One issue you could fund, carry out, implement, and make a difference. And I would like you to address that. Not in abstractions, but very practical, focused, because you know a great deal about Nigeria and what is a low-hanging fruit would make a difference. Thank you.
Great. So, Joe, just right behind.
Hi, Joe Kraus with the One Campaign. We have an office in Abuja, and I was there last month and meeting with a number of organizations that are doing really interesting work on accountability, on social accountability. So there's Budget, Tracka, Follow the Money, sort of the well-known organizations, but there's a lot of other organizations doing really interesting work at the local level around social audits and those types of things. And I'm just wondering, so two questions. One, what role do you think DataFight could play in terms of being a repository for those types of initiatives and elevating them and giving them a platform where they could get national attention and sort of information sharing with other organizations who may be doing similar work in a different space and may not know each other or talk to each other. And then two, relatedly, since a lot of that work happens at the state or local level, what role or what level of data are you looking to include? Is it federal or state and local, especially given the importance in the federal system? A lot of education, health, and other social service spending actually happens at the state and local level. So it'd be really interesting to hear what level of data you're looking at, whether it's national, state, and local, or both. Thank you.
Okay, then let's just take one more. The woman in the back.
Hi, I'm Kara Jones from ORB. Hi, Joe. Nice to see you. I have two questions, and they're both about the data quality in the data set. So my first question is, as we all know, even under the best of circumstances, data in Nigeria is fraught and challenging to collect and even more challenging to report on, right? So how do we envision, or how do you envision the usage of data through DataFight given the problematic nature of data that even comes from the Nigerian government? And then second of all, you touched a little bit on data from other sources, and I think this goes in line with kind of Joe's thought about this being a repository for potential usage by other entities. So where would you get all of the other sources of data? How could you put that into the government data, or how could you manage that process if that was something that you were seeking to do? And then how would you manage quality control out of that data as well? So like Red Cross collects a whole set of data. UNICEF collects great data in some cases. Other even commercial entities collect a lot of data. So how could this integrate those collections as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you, for the questions. Thank you, Paul, for meeting me last week. So how do you leverage Premium Times' reputation to do this? I don't know whether it's to leverage or to say just to consolidate, because everything, like I said earlier, is part of, the reflections that Premium Time as a group, which is, of course, an enabler for the media industry, when it comes to revenue sustainability, is trying to move. How will DataFi leverage that? I think it's part of the campaign or, activity that we already considered to bring, development partners, bring even, private investors who are interested in, good data that is useful for policy decision-making and even for investment decision-making in the country. So it's more or less just a continuation of what we've started. And more practically, I think we've marked for ourselves, about 3 different type of data to start with. The first one for us is even the pricing data. So price affects both the public procurement process, and it also helps even the investment and various forms of corporate need, right? So we've started an initiative which we call Price Board in the country, which is looking at market data, consumer, price data, and all of that. So it's work in progress, and we're trying to see how much of, that we can leverage. But from the side of, like I mentioned, from governance side, the more important one, which is development data for us, is very important. How can we collect raw, data, and consolidate with whatever government is also collecting to speak to issue of health and education in the country? We hear a lot of data that come from, government about enrollment, about, infant mortality, but there are ways that we believe that technology can help us even in collecting data, and we're relying very much more. We have a triangle of innovation that we have. We think that technology, data, and storytelling, when you mix them together, you are able to drive, not only media sustainability, but also governance and, innovation entirely. So we believe that we can, and maybe this will also help to talk to the challenge of how do we, handle this issue of data quality, and how do we handle the issue, enormous challenge of data collection. We've seen initiatives that have worked, in other, climes, and we think that we can use technology and crowdsourcing to collect more data that we can verify. We've experimented with, service delivery in the health sector. We are still working on improving on that, and we think that we can use citizens and, and strategic, actors like students, like civil society to collect more data. So price and development data, health, agriculture, and extractive is important to us. Extractive is, is a big one. Security is a bigger challenge. We don't even know, we always rely on, external data to know the number of people that have died in the country. We've started an initiative, we started about 4 months ago, where we are curating the number of reported fatalities and other issues, in the media, how they report, security and violence and conflict in the country. We're trying to use that to first inform our media reports, to also use it to talk about, the data opacity, in reporting violence. But also use it to also inform policy and also development assistance regarding that. We want to do ground truthing, essentially. We want to do ground truthing. We want to use technology to drive that. We want to use, human crowdsourcing to do that as far as we can. In terms of becoming a repository, I would say the key civil society organizations working in the open data space, we've interacted with them from the beginning. Like I said, we've worked with, PPDC in Nigeria. We've worked with, School of Media and Communication in Lagos to develop Budeshi, and we see what we can do with other institutions that are doing that. But like I initially mentioned in my presentation, the goal is to work with all of these initiatives to help first pull the data that they have, put it in one place, and then we can begin to look at the second layer of intervention, either to use it to drive more at the sub-national level, so for us it's grassroots data, if you like, or you can say local data. So federal issues, I think at the federal level you're getting more, openness in terms of data somewhat. But what about the everyday data that we are missing? The number of deaths, the number of births, diseases, crime data. We don't have a crime data in Nigeria that you can rely on. And try to work with civil society organizations and even government institutions. We are open. DataFight is quite open to work with even the Nigeria Internal Service, to see how we can collect and data on crime and use it to affect policy. So it's a rounded strategy in working with civil society and government to do that. Data quality. So far, our experimentation has been when it's crowdsourced, we look for other ways to verify. We've experimented crowdsourcing with our health project. We've also done the same with our press attack project. So we look for more than one source to verify. We also believe that when it is captured using technology, it becomes more verified. The quality is even more. You have a degree of confidence in the data that you collect in that regard, essentially.
Two quick additions. To Joe's question, I would say I think clearly there is a need for more data, particularly at the state and local government level. As Joshua said, the federal government is increasingly sharing some data. And there's been progress on that front, but I think in the short to medium term, the local government data would be very difficult to get, and I think very difficult to push for accountability around because of the lack of democratic structures at that level throughout much of the country. I think with states, some you could probably make progress in, particularly those that generate some of their own revenue. I think those that are more reliant on federal revenues, it may be more challenging. On the quality of the data, I would say, yes, you can crowdsource data and there can be concerns about that, but I would say the quality of government data also can be quite problematic. As you mentioned, you're really running off revised estimates of the 2006 census, and even if you looked at the distribution and sort of gender distribution on that front, the numbers seem interesting in terms of how those are presented, and there are challenges and questions, I think, around voter registration and the like in terms of the figures that are produced and even the electoral outcomes as well. And those will be obviously uphill challenges that DataFight will have to pursue moving forward.
Okay, let's take another round. Woman in the red shirt has had her hand up for quite a while, very patiently. And then Xerxes, and then the man behind the woman in the red shirt.
Hello, my name is Kayla Green. I'm a student at Arizona State University. And I guess I have two questions for you. The first one being is, do you think that DataFight can play an important part in deterring the brain drain that is happening in African nations such as Nigeria? And also, what role do you think data circulation can play in creating and sustaining an economy that can support the amount of intellectuals that countries such as Nigeria are producing to help them stay in the countries because enough jobs are being created for those people?
Xerxes?
Xerxes Spencer with the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you, Joshua, for your terrific presentation. Joshua, I was struck by the absence of any mention of Freedom of Information Act, Freedom of Information, access to information in your presentation. And I wonder if you could comment on the existing Freedom of Information Act that I understand does exist in Nigeria and its intersection with your open data journalism project, do you, for instance, see your data fight as a way for the better implementation of the existing Freedom of Information Act in Nigeria? What do you see as the interaction between those two topics? Thank you.
Okay, and then there was a gentleman behind the woman in the red shirt, and then we'll go to the woman next to Chris Walker.
Excuse me. Hi, everyone. My name is Ife Akinmade. I am a student at George Washington University. I'm a summer fellow at Transparency and Accountability Initiative. I'm very grateful for your presentation. My question is very simple. It's basically, Nigeria's situation is not just, what's it called, for Nigeria alone. It's a problem, data is a problem, data transparency is a problem that affects many sub-Saharan African countries. In your opinion, Joshua and Chris, are there any other models that have been employed in other sub-Saharan African countries that Nigeria can sort of follow to ensure that data transparency is actually helping drive social change in the country itself?
Okay, can we take one more?
Yeah, sure.
The woman next to Chris Walker. Yes, please, go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ibilola Oyele. I'm with Chemonics International. Thank you so much for being here. Data collection is often expensive, and that often is the reason why it falls to outside sources to do so. In addition to that, the dividends or benefits aren't often immediately seen. They're more seen in the long-term run. So I'm just wondering, from your opinion, how do you often pitch to federal or local governments the importance of doing so, the financial reasons of doing so, and what are the short-term and long-term benefits that you cite when doing so?
These are all great questions.
Okay, thank you. The first question, I think it would be a big aspiration for DataFi to say it can help in any way to curb brain drain in the country. But as much as that can be, the amount of people, that it can engage, employ, or retain in the country will be, the level of I would say intervention or support that the DataFi can do for the brain drain challenge. But I think the brain drain challenge, you will know that it's more of a safety net, infrastructural, challenge beyond what one organization or one, emerging, outfit or initiative will say it can resolve entirely. So even if DataFi in the next 10, 20 years can employ 50,000 people, that's just a little, of what, countries like Canada, America is doing to Nigeria's intelligence community as a whole. But the idea is also to collaborate with the diaspora. Even if you're outside of the country, how much of contribution can you make to the development of the country, and initiatives like this. While I've been here, the idea is to even look at what's the diaspora of Nigeria and how can we leverage that community even to drive both the data work, the accountability work, and also the media sustainability challenge. So it's part of, I would say, part of the idea to say if you've been exported, as a Nigerian brain, we can also still make a lot of impact together. And if you've been following the numbers, you will see that what you get as remittances from the diaspora in Nigeria is almost about 60% of what our budget will look like every year. And so that means you have a lot of diaspora community that have invested interest in Nigeria. And so you can always work around that. And that's one thing that we think we can always leverage. Freedom of information. I think the freedom of we've experimented with the freedom of information a lot. It's what has driven most of our work. Like I mentioned when I was talking about how open data has helped address corruption in Nigeria. I mentioned that the data that we've collected were through freedom of information requests. We one organization out of a few that continue to use freedom of information to demand information that is supposed to be proactively available. And when we can't even get what we want, we still go further to also test the law and as I was saying that, I saw the rule of law expert here, and I know he can take me on that. But we try to see how much we can also use the legal, instrument to also make government give us more information. So it's going to be driven a lot by freedom of information and its capacity. I think that the civil society and the media in Nigeria still have we still have a lot to do in terms of making the Freedom of Information Act work. But so far, it's been instrumental to what DataFight is doing and what it will still do in the future, and it will be a way to also enhance that process as a whole. Example. I think if you're looking for examples of say countries that open data has helped, I would say Kenya and South Africa have been two great, inspiration. The amount of data that is made available in South Africa, has helped the accountability work. Also provided inspiration for even DataFight, and also the same thing with Kenya. We relied on how much of technological, innovations to open data in Kenya and in South Africa also to drive how we also think or strategize around what DataFight can achieve and the mileage it can go. So those are two great examples. I can also provide, what we see, emerging democracies, like Rwanda, like Ghana, also try to do. But if you compare vis-a-vis our own test of freedom of information and that of Ghana that was just passed about a month ago, you see that we've also gone. And someone was telling me today that Nigeria is so pluralistic when it comes to its democracy, only that we have a lot of, just a large amount of challenge, in the country. So at the end of the day, I believe that the availability of data is for government, as much as it is political, it is also capacity. So if you can drive capacity development, and also find other incentives and motivation for government to collect more data, perhaps it can help both the corporate and the public sector, efficiency and innovation. How do we pitch data collection, right?
What's the financial argument?
How do we pitch it to government? I think at the moment, for us, is to talk about the counter, argument to it, rather than what the financial, implication is. The fact that it creates leakages. I mentioned the ghost workers, because in Nigeria, you don't know the number of, public servants that you have. You don't even know the number of teachers that you have in a state, or the number of students that you have. At every point that you are budgeting, or that you are, making policy decisions, you find out that you have a lot of wastages. We've had in a country in Nigeria where the ministry is trying to develop just a notice board website with 650 million naira. That's roughly about $2 million just to build a website. And so you see, so the challenge is at the moment the incentive is it helps you, reduce, leakages, that unwarranted leakages in the economy, and in the long run also pitching to them examples of innovations that have worked, innovations that have relied on available data to drive what they do. You have great examples in the private sector like OConnor, like other ones that are coming up. But for us, it's also how much of I think you already alluded to the fact that it's a long-term thing, and it's for them to also see that development planning, is always long-term, and you have to be able to see into the future to be able to achieve or derive, the benefits therein.
Joshua, I remember in another setting you explaining that the Nigerian government doesn't know where the contracts to some of the kind of rare earth natural resources versus the oil deposits are going, and you would think that that would be an argument if we have better data on how many Chinese firms are getting access to our treasures. That would be an important thing to know and an important incentive for the government.
Yeah, that's a great incentive. And, the conversation you're referring to is, as Nigeria, based on the challenge that we had with recession, we're looking for alternative sector to explore. And you have solid minerals where we don't even have data to drive either incentivizing the sector or even, measuring what's the potential. There's been a report that says that the current, exploration of the solid minerals in Nigeria can provide ×4 of what the Nigerian budget is annually. But the challenge is we don't know the number of, we don't know the number of licenses that are available, and when we even know the number of licenses, we don't know the amount of production figure because we don't have accurate figure for that. That's one. The other one is also the fact that if you just take a bird's-eye view of how Nigerian economy is driven, you see that it is highly driven by informal sector. But we don't have any government data that has captured, our informal sector to know what the tax, potential of that, even for government. Yeah. The everyday guy who sells on the street, what kind of revenue that you can get from that. But if you have not captured his identity, to be able to even track how much he earns, to track, what. So there are a lot of things that government can derive from, data collection and making it also available. If you don't know we always talk about the fact that the agricultural sector, employs the largest amount of labor in Nigeria. But I'm wondering how much of revenue Nigerian government derives from that sector, because there is no data. So it's the more data that it collects and it makes available to the public to either help to inform or to criticize how they come about, revenue generation and every other kind of policy. I think the better for the economy, the better for the country, and the better score for any government that makes that possible.
Great, thank you. Okay, good. We are almost out of time, but we probably have time for about 2 more questions if they're quick, if they're out there. So you, and I can't see the hands. Yeah.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Can you just introduce yourself? I'm sorry.
I was just going to do that.
So
My name is Deirdre Lepin, and I'm a long-standing student and resident of Nigeria. And I have worked on data quite a lot in Nigeria. And one of the things that I've seen is that the big incentive for government to collect data usually comes from donors. I mean, at the very top, the SDGs are a big driver for the collection of data because it's part of the national reputation for reaching or not reaching certain SDG goals. Another is that donors often fund the data collection. The census, for example, has not been undertaken in part because the funding hasn't come forward from the traditional donors for the census, as it has in the past. The health sector is particularly good at collecting data because of the number of health projects that insist on good data collection. Do you think that this international pressure or interest on data collection is important? Do you think it should continue? Should it increase?
Yeah. And last question goes to...
Hi, I'm Tammy Abiraba. I'm the associate for the Africa program at the Center for International Policy. So my question was, within the Fourth Republic of Nigeria's government, or of Nigeria as a democracy, which president do you feel has helped accessibility to data kind of progress the most?
Okay, thank you. Should it continue? I think yes, but like we always, reflect on, I think the strategic engagement of donor agencies when they, fund government to collect data is something that needs to be reviewed because there's a bit of defect in it. When it is not, I would say comprehensive in how it is done, it creates a lot of challenge. You don't just give government all the support without aligning it with either the civil society or some other public or private alliances to help drive first the quality and some form of capacity. I mentioned even if you give all the money to Nigerian government to conduct census, do they have a capacity? Do they have the knowledge And would they do it for the sole purpose of, accuracy and, usability and, of the data? 2 months ago, I was looking for the population data of Nigeria. That's 2006 data. I went to the National Population Commission website. It's no more there. Aha, you see? So all the investment that went into that, today, if as an organization we had not, kept that data, or we don't have other ways to, find data that is lost in the, call it the space, then there's a bigger crisis. And so that means it's somewhere in the system, but at every point in time, every new government comes in, our website, the government website is always redesigned, and a lot of data is lost in that process. And so what that means is that when you're doing that kind of investment or support to government, assistance to government, make sure that you involve institutions. And maybe that brings me back to the question that Paul asked. It's an opportunity for the development community to look at initiatives like DataFight, like Premium Times, that is looking at data quality for its work, for government, for democratic purposes, and also bring them together. The Open Government Partnership in Nigeria is supposed to be government and civil society. The major challenge that it's having in the country is the fact that government is not ready to work with the civil society counterpart, and that is because the funds is with the government. And so government wants to do everything it can do with every money that it has, and sideline the civil society. So when such assistance come, you need to be sure that you've done the right mapping, and you make sure that it is credible, reliable, organizations with integrity that you're investing such funds with. If you're giving, if the development community is going to rescue Nigeria, during the census, you want to be sure that there's a lot of capacity that has gone into that. You want to also look at some pockets of development, data that are not in that scope that you want to give to institutions, that collect data to also help you collect, and then you can use that for whatever you are doing. I've seen a lot of reports, a lot of collaboration between, UNICEF, United Nations, World Bank, with government agencies, and you're looking at the data. Even from the methodology, you can tell the capacity, is missing. So that's for me is to say yes, we need more of it, but it needs to be more strategic. It also needs to incorporate the part where the data that is collected is also given to journalists, and civil society to use. There are a lot of World Bank data out there. Journalists don't even know how to interpret it. And so you need to build the capacity of the media, to be able to also make sense or provide intelligence for every data that you collect. So we collect every month, every quarter, employment, revenue, and disease and different type of data in Nigeria, right? But who talks about them? Who uses them to, criticize or give insights to government and any other policymaker? That's something I think the development community or the donor agencies need to consider. It's high time that it begins, and I think the CIMA report had spoken, mentioned this, the need for donor agencies to begin to look at media while they're thinking of their, comprehensive assistance to countries as a whole. I think I forgot your question.
I think it was which leader of the...
Okay, which leader? Opinion. I always run away from opinion, but I think that each of the administrations that we've had, we did a report which we call the 4 seasons of lavishness in Nigeria, and we trace it from Obasanjo to Buhari. And so if you put the key leaders, Buhari, Yar'Adua, Jonathan, I think they've all played different roles. You get. Obasanjo started with the NFIU, which was to look at, illicit financial flow, did the EFCC, Jonathan, at the end of the day, handed over, freedom of information, which has now become an instrument. So at every point in time, if you want me to be very blunt, which I'm not sure I want to do, I think this administration has more responsibility because it had, predecessors that have created, some form of, foundational, call it support, call it interventions that it can run on, right? I think we've had like a decline in